Welcome to Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery, a conversation held at the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and everyday living. Your hosts, Marc Regala and Justin Wolf, bring both professional expertise and personal understanding to the table. So welcome to the conversation. Let's dive in.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery. My name is Justin Wolf, joined by my co-host, Marc Regala, this evening. Marc, how you doing tonight, man?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Hanging in there. Just can't wait for the Cardinals to take the field and get after it there on the diamond here. So,
It's getting close.
St. Louis. Let me just clarify. St. Louis Cardinals for all those Chicago listeners.
We just lost a fan base.
Yeah, well.
We just lost a couple of fibers.
Yeah. So is there a rewind button? I could just hit rewind, pull those words back into my mouth.
You might want. No, but in all seriousness, ending of February, light at the end of the tunnel. We're less than a month away from officially the first day of spring. We got spring training in full tilt. We're about a month or so away from the official opening day of the Major League Baseball season. Days longer. Hopefully we start seeing much warmer weather sooner as opposed to later, and we're slowly getting through this winter, which is a good thing.
Definitely. I mean, we're talking about getting through this and like having the winter in the rear view. It's like I remember like snow on opening day. And that's kind of like the thoughts and like the picture in my head. It's like it'd be nice if like the weather would cooperate with like what we would like it to do. I mean, that'd be awesome.
I've been to opening days where it was 75 and sunny, and I've been to opening days where it was snowy and very cold. So,
what a wide range of experiences.
Chicago, baby.
So true. Well, today I think we got a good topic, and I'm kind of looking forward to kind of diving into this with you as we're doing the one thing that our topic does not enjoy. We are going to be talking about understanding anxiety and what comes with this challenging emotional experience. Because I think when we're talking about anxiety, very often it is just like, don't talk about it. Why is this feeling up? This isn't natural. This isn't normal. I should feel different, or I should be thinking different, or my thoughts are just overwhelming me. There's just so much flying around when we talk about anxiety becoming present. And I think that's when we talk about really just at the beginning of all this is even just defining what is anxiety, because we throw this blanket term around so much. And so just kind of for like the frame for our listeners and for today's conversation, we're not going to dive into like a DSM-5 TR diagnosis of anxiety. And you have to meet these many symptoms for this period of time and it has to have this impact. Like this is just anxiety is a natural response to a stressful situation. When anything is different than the norm, it makes sense that we would have a reaction to it, or in our brain would be responding to it as well. So that's a normal reaction, right? And I think anxiety kind of gets a bad rap. Anxiety kind of gets like pegged as like this bad negative experience that people have where it's like, hey, if it weren't for anxiety, like we would not have survived as a species. Like we would have seen like the saber-toothed tiger or that T-Rex approaching us and be like, wonder what that thing's going to do. I like its big, shiny, sharp teeth. Think they could bite? Oh, game over. Right? And I think that's the part where it's like these internal alarms are there for a reason. And so I'm just kind of curious, Marc, if you just want to kind of like dive in, man, and kind of just talk about like what would you say kind of differentiates that like normal anxiety from that of one that's problematic?
Well, I mean, speaking from my perspective, and again, my situation is a little weird because I always thought that I was an anxious person, but I really thought that was just being normal. I didn't think there was anything ordinary about it until I started working with the therapist and I got diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. And then for myself personally, I did get panic attacks, specifically when I would do like speeches in school or run meetings in the insurance industry and things like that. But again, I never viewed it as really a panic attack because I really didn't know what the definition of a panic attack was. I mean, I just felt obviously uneasy and shortness of breath and, heart beating out of the chest and couldn't get the words out. And quite frankly, I just thought there was something wrong with me. I really did. And, once you have that, in that particular situation, it's like every time you need to speak publicly, your brain goes back to, that I guess fight or flight response. And even though you try to self talk and try to compose yourself to try to put yourself in a position where you wouldn't have a panic attack, I found myself, continuing to have them when I would speak publicly. Um, I mean, I was looking back at it. I mean, I was always, like you said, an anxious person. I was always a worrier. I was a planner. I would always worry about the little things. I was stressed out about the little things that probably the average person wouldn't stress out about. And I remember having conversations with my parents, specifically my dad, and he would tell me, because you worry about too many things. You get stressed, you get angry, you get anxious, too quickly. But I just thought it was just me. I just thought it was me being normal. Well, hindsight, looking back at it, I mean, I've dealt with this pretty much my whole life, quite frankly. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people is they really truly don't know what their diagnosis is because they don't talk to a therapist. They don't know that there's something wrong on the inside. And then, a lot of times what will happen is it will lead, to some type of self-coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
A lot of times, specifically in my case, it led to alcohol, which would be a temporary anxiety reliever. But then you're caught in that vicious cycle because you might get some temporary relief, with a night of drinking, but then the effects of alcohol after a night of drinking escalates that anxiety to another level, and now you're really, really in a situation where you're feeling anxious.
Definitely. And I think that's you're really highlighting, man. Like kind of like what is that impulse or that drive comes that we experience when we're experiencing anxiety, and when it shows up and we're feeling uncomfortable. Naturally, as people, what do we want to do? We want to feel good. We don't want to feel bad, or we don't want to feel uncomfortable. So therefore, we're going to make a choice that's geared at trying to eliminate the very thing that's making us feel uncomfortable. And
Right.
that's a lot of times what anxiety is driving at, right? It's like those symptoms. Like it could be a lot of times it's like avoidance. Like I just need to avoid this situation because this situation is incredibly anxiety provoking or stressful and it overwhelms me. So I'm going to avoid that altogether. And when we're kind of like you were just highlighting it, like that triggers that fight or flight response. I think that's spot on
Yeah.
because you look at where does that come from? Like that's that natural inclination that myself in this moment, my safety and my survival is in danger. And that's exactly what our mind has a hard time differentiating between actual threat or that felt sense of threat because both are being interpreted as very real. So it's going to be whatever like our default natural is. You hear fight, flight, freeze. We're going to go to that as a way to try and preserve and establish a sense of safety in those moments to help ourselves see that next moment. Now, you brought up the idea of like different coping mechanisms. Like a lot of people will look to alcohol. A lot of people will also look at how their world becomes a lot smaller because of anxiety, because of the influence and the impact that it has on their choices and their actions. And that's the part that it becomes really hard to not do that. You know, like that instant gratification that you get from like, oh my gosh, I got a temporary relief. I can actually take a deep breath. My heart's not going to explode out of my chest. Um, or I feel like I'm going to die right now. And there's just this myriad of like rapid thoughts flying around. And it's like the moment you get some relief from that, like that is incredibly reinforcing.
Yeah, I mean, the best way that I can describe it, and the best analogy I can give is almost like, for me personally, it's just the way I do. It's like you're in a room and you feel like the walls are just closing in on you, and they're closing in on you, and they're closing in on you. And now you're becoming constricted. Now you're feeling uncomfortable, and now you want to get out of that uncomfortable feeling, and you resort to different things to try to get out of that situation. And a lot of times it's not healthy coping mechanisms because you don't know any better. And that could be anything. I mean, it could be excess shopping. It could be gambling. It could be drugs. It could be alcohol. Um, eating.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and that's where poor dietary issues come into play. Which could lead to some physical issues down the road. It certainly led to some physical issues with me with my neck and back issue because my diet really was not very good as a result of some of the things I was dealing with, which then has some other lasting effects on you. So I mean, it's something that needs to be addressed. It's something that you need to learn. It's something that you need to cope with in a healthy way. But you don't know what you don't know, and that's where the education comes into play. That's where working with a therapist comes into play. Being able to express yourself and your feelings and how you feel during certain situations comes into play, so you can rely on professionals to give you ways to be able to deal or cope with it in a much healthier way.
Definitely. I mean, it's like kind of like learning a new relationship with your thoughts, with what you're experiencing, and not kind of falling back into those default autopilot like settings that our mind tends to create.
Correct.
I mean, I think that's a challenge, right? Because you're kind of talking about like responding differently than you historically have when this feeling or this thought emerges. It's kind of going against almost like that knee jerk autopilot response that kicks into gear. And that's the challenge because a lot of times when we talk about anxiety, we all like to try and figure out like where's this coming from? Because if I can figure out where this is coming from and why this is showing up, then I can get rid of it. And the reality is that if it were that simple, like nobody would ever experience anxiety. Hence your example of kind of using alcohol, which is a very common example that people talk about using in social situations, aka liquid courage. It kind of gets like those thoughts to kind of like die down a little bit so I could take that initial step that I want to be taking, but I have a hard time doing that on my own end. And so I think that's the part where you kind of look at just how this is wired into the individual, like how people experience this and how everybody really experiences this, because it's tied into our brain chemistry, the way in which our brain is operating, interpreting what we are receiving from the environment and how that is kind of going down those pathways that have been connected and ingrained throughout time. That's going to activate our nervous system, which is like the system in our brain that goes like, oh my God, this is a threat. And the alarm system is going and it's saying danger, danger, danger. And it's firing at like this rapid pace when anxiety is being experienced within the body, which is like, oh my gosh, I need to just take cover.
Yeah.
And the challenge is like, as much as we'd like to kind of say, hey, I can just kind of learn to respond to that differently, which is true. You can, and many people do. It's also challenging when this is kind of just not the way that your brain and the way it's kind of interpreting what's going on in the world is also being influenced by our genetic predisposition, because you tend to see the way in which we inherit our genes, and when we talk about like anxiety disorders, you can kind of look up and down a tree and there is usually a common thread there in terms of individuals who have experienced it. And again, this is something that really, when we're talking about brain, the way the brain is conditioned, hardwired, that makes sense why this is passed down generation to generation to generation. Because when we kind of trace it all back, again, anxiety at its core is not a bad thing. It helped us survive in a world where there was a lot of threats, and that if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have been here. So that trait has been identified as like, hey, this is a really useful trait for our species to continue to have in order to continue surviving. Now, the challenge is our world has advanced at much greater rates, at a much quicker rate than our brain and our system has evolved over time. So hence our great ancestors never had to worry about, oh my God, nobody's texted me in the last hour. Everybody hates me. Or I could be doing X, Y, like I'm right. It's just like the technology world today. Like one of the greatest fears that you always hear from people, right, is like the idea of like missing out or not being included.
Right.
Or you talk about bullying or, internet attacks that just when it historically used to be. I remember talking about this, like when I used to work back in like the adolescent program, like really kind of, you validate everybody's experience, because if you're experiencing bullying at school, what used to historically happen is like when you and I were growing up, because we're dinosaurs, is that like that bullying would stop at school. You get home, it's safe, you have a safe environment, you can relax, you can let your guard down. Now, because of the way the social world is,
Can't get away from
and exactly,
it.
there's no escaping it.
Yep.
Yeah. And I know one of the other things that kind of feeds into this that I know you've kind of shared, and I think this be a great area for you to kind of like share and elaborate upon, man. It's just the impact of whether it's trauma that people experience that kind of feeds into anxiety, or just overall like childhood experiences and how those experiences when you're young kind of shape the way you interpret and experience the world moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different factors that come into play, you know, and just from my work inside the community and just even from my personal experiences. I mean, obviously, we talked about the genetic side of things. Um, I mean, it can be a perceived, you know, traumatic event. You know, when you were younger, it could be parents going through a divorce. It could be the loss of a relative, loss of a parent. It could be bouncing back and forth between the two parents' house. You know, when the
Yeah.
child is minor. It could be losing a job. It could be what we're dealing with right now economically. You know, a lot of people are feeling financial stress right now because of the current economic conditions, which I think is leading, you know, to some of the things we're seeing, you know, with the alcohol usage and things like that. I mean, it could be, like you said, bullying. Um, I mean, it could be the childhood that you had, and maybe you were around a parent that was a little bit of a yeller, a little more vocal, you know, and you know, you get a little jumpy, you know, because you're used to hearing yelling, and that creates anxiousness as well or anxiety as well. I mean, there's just so many factors contributing to it that I've seen personally, like in my story, but also just from visiting patients in the hospital and leading support groups and so forth. I mean, you really can't point a finger at one thing, and I think that's what makes this so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it could be a variety of factors, and quite frankly, it could be a conglomerate of factors. You know, depending on that individual's upbringing and what they've dealt with in life, just in general.
Right, because like those experiences in and of itself, like those are going to shape the way in which you're interpreting what the world's giving you to work with. And I think that's the part where it's like those feelings and those thoughts can feel out of control. Like there is no way to make it stop. And so people can get very creative in the ways in which they try to make it stop. And I think you kind of highlighted some of those things that it does impact, right? Because sometimes like if those thoughts and those experiences show up when people are sleeping, well, I've known people who go to great lengths to make sure that they don't go to sleep.
Yeah,
And then you think about like how much of yourself are you bringing forward when you haven't gotten a good night's rest?
yeah,
Like that's a really difficult way to have to manage whatever the day is bringing your way and your own internal emotional experiences. And you think about what what do you tend to gravitate towards when you're pretty feeling pretty emotional and you're looking to eat something? You're looking for food that is going to be instantly gratifying, right? Which tend to be like higher fat, higher sugar, something that's going to kind of like light up your brain, like oh, instant relief, right? So like, or you kind of hear the other flip side of just anxiety leading to people not even having an appetite. And that part where it's like, I'm not even hungry. I've been so anxious. My stomach's in knots. I can't eat. Right. And I know I mentioned sleep a second ago, but you also think about like just worrying about what's going to come the next day and just kind of role playing that in your head, every possible scenario, because that's a normal thing that happens. Or recounting all the events of the day and thinking about, oh my God, like, how did I come across? And then the judgments that follow when we start asking ourselves questions, we're feeling pretty heightened emotionally. We don't tend to respond in the most compassionate or understanding way. We tend to respond pretty harshly when we're feeling pretty heightened anxiety. And we tend to start critiquing or evaluating and assessing our own choices, our own actions. And I think one of the things that also gets impacted is an area that you've spoken very candidly about that's been very critical and helpful in your own program is just exercise,
yeah.
right? Like that tends to just disappear in these moments when anxiety is taking the ropes and kind of driving everything.
Yeah, just a couple things here. I mean, you gave a couple examples there about, chasing pleasure with the diet, with high fat or high sugar. What is that going to do? Now you're gonna have some other issues going on there too, because now that's gonna affect the brain chemistry in your head, specifically your serotonin and dopamine levels. And what that's gonna do is now you're dealing with the anxiety, but now that could lead to depressive thoughts. And I think that's important to understand. If you
Mhm.
start talking about, starving yourself, becoming malnutrition, again, the same thing, to be able to drag those feel good chemicals in your brain to a therapeutic level, you have to have the right diet. You have to have the right protein intakes. So again, if you're becoming malnutrition as a result of the stress or the anxiety you're facing, that in itself could lead to some of those mood altering chemicals in your brain becoming unbalanced and can lead to depression as well. When you're in a stressful situation, or you're feeling anxious, your body releases a stress hormone by the name of cortisol. And, cortisol really affects the way your body breaks down foods. You're not necessarily getting nutrition out of the foods that you normally would, and it tends to basically store a lot of the foods as fat. So that's typically when you put on weight. The other thing about stressful situations, and cortisol, the stress hormone, and this is what I've read online, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, Justin, but I've always heard that, like in socioeconomic depressed areas, okay, where you got high crime and you're struggling financially or what have you, and you get a woman that's pregnant, that stress hormone, that cortisol, can actually pass through the umbilical cord, and that can actually affect the baby inside the womb during the gestational period there, where it actually can affect that brain chemistry. Now that brain is technically predisposed, to some type of anxiety, once that baby becomes a child and a young adult or what have you. Well, and that could lead to some mental health issues in some of those socioeconomic deprived neighborhoods as well. And that's what we've seen that lead to, increased numbers of alcohol and drugs. Well, if you look at where we're at right now as a society, with where we're at. I've heard stories now in the last, month or so. Are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? The job, the new jobs reports coming out, and companies are not hiring the way they were hiring. You got, cost of groceries continuing to escalate and so forth. People are really, really feeling that stress. And now you not only just have those particular neighborhoods that are dealing with this, but it's everyday America is feeling some of this stress or some of this anxiety. So imagine what's going on for a young mom that's expecting, and she's feeling that stress, and their cortisol levels are elevated. That's going to get passed along to the baby as well. What is the impact going to have on society? 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, with what we're seeing right now from an economic perspective. So it's very deep. I think society in general needs to be educated. I think we have to try to learn healthy coping skills, because there are alternatives than unhealthy, with the drinking and eating and, and things like that. And try to reduce that stress level as best as we possibly can. It's never going to be taken away. Like you said, it's something that we need, as a human being. That's part of us, but how can we de-escalate it a little bit to get to the point where it's not affecting our day-to-day living as much as it has or it potentially could?
Right. I think that's kind of like the answer everybody's searching for, especially when you're caught up in the grips of anxiety,
Yeah.
you know, where it's like, I just need to make sure this doesn't continue to sabotage and hurt my relationships, my employment, my, social situations, right? Because it's like you hear a lot of times about people like being hyper fixated on upcoming, whether it's like gatherings or social events where they're just very anxious about having to engage and interact with others, right? So I think that's the part where really looking at how do I make sure that this emotion, this experience, that again, I think recognizing and acknowledging is really kind of like, it's kind of like the first step in it all, is acknowledging and noticing I'm going to lean into this feeling of uncomfortability, because refusing to accept it, well, guess what? That's just fed it and given it more power, right? Especially when you kind of look at like, I just want to get rid of this. I don't want to see it. It's almost kind of like, kind of look at it like it's like a bad ex that you're just like, God, I know where they like to go around town. I know where they hang out. I know who they talk to. So I'm not going there. I'm going to really ensure I go to great lengths to make sure that I don't see them, I don't talk to them, I don't see anybody that associates with them. So my world naturally is a way of trying to protect myself from this, just got a heck of a lot smaller
Yeah.
because I refuse to see them. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. Like I'm trying to be like the ostrich, burying my head in the sand, pretend like they are not here. And guess what? They're walking on their merry way any which way they choose to. And so them just existing in my mind is leading to me going into just full out avoidance mode, which is not helpful because everything is driven by just the fact that I want to avoid that. So the very thing that I refuse to accept is actually controlling the choices and the decisions I'm making on a day in and day out basis, which becomes problematic. So that's the first part, is just acknowledging and making contact with those very things that are going to make you experience that level of uncomfortability. And I think that's the part of beginning to lean into it. Starts with actually building and establishing some different skills that will allow you to engage with the thoughts or in those bodily and physiological sensations differently than you historically have.
You know, and you brought up something earlier, and I didn't jump on it, but I do want to jump on it now. Exercise or the gym, and that's on in my
I knew
recovery.
you'd take that opportunity, Mark. That's your
I mean, you brought it
yeah.
up. I didn't bring it up. So, but I cannot stress it enough. I go to the gym because of what it does to my mental health. Okay, it helps me with my depression. It helps me with my anxiety. It helps me stay sober.
Yeah.
I often say that my day starts with the therapy session, and the therapy session for me personally is the weights. To me, there's nothing better than putting some good music on, you know, killing my body, working up a good sweat, getting my thoughts arranged for the day, what are the tasks at hand for the day, just kind of get my day in order mentally. I don't know, it relaxes me. And I realize it's different for everybody, and I think people need to find, that area, that's going to work for them. But I do believe that some form of exercise is very, very important, when it comes to your mental health, when you're dealing with anything, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I cannot stress that enough. And what your definition of exercise is, that's between you and the person in the mirror. I don't care if it's walking 10,000 steps per day, going swimming at the Y, walk around the mall with your dog, because some of these malls are pet friendly, or do CrossFit or lift weights or whatever the hell it is. You got to get your body moving. That's going to help. And then diet. Diet is very important. Okay, because again, it comes down to those feel good chemicals in your brain, and you have to have the proper nutrition to get those chemicals in a therapeutic balance, and you have to put the right foods in your body. And I say this, and I mean this sincerely. Like, I eat my food as medicine. I mean, it's going to sound kind of crazy, but I mean, if I don't see any nutritional value in something that somebody's putting in front of me, I'm not going to ingest it. I'm going to ingest empty calories. I mean, I'm looking at the protein, I'm looking at the carbs, I'm looking at what does it do for me mentally and physically, and does it make sense for me to consume this? And that has helped a lot, slowing down the thoughts, thinking through the process, making sure I'm eating the right foods. Because again, I've struggled mightily on the mental health side, and I've struggled mightily on the addiction side. I don't want to go backwards. And to me, it's about today moving forward. I cannot stress that enough.
Definitely. And kind of when you're talking about like mental health, and because that's what we're all talking about, right? Whether it's substance use disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, these disorders and these diagnoses all come from the same book. And I think that's really kind of important for us to kind of recognize and acknowledge that there's a lot of tools and there's a lot of resources out there that are transdiagnostic, which is just a fancy way of saying like it's been shown to be effective for a very varying diagnoses. Um, and there's the new third wave of CBT that's out there. You talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, which is saying, hey, I got to make space for this thought or these feelings that are going to be uncomfortable. And I don't have to attach to them, right? And I can still move forward in a life that is driven by my values while I continue to show up the way I want to be. It's a very shorthand way of describing ACT. I know I definitely did not do it the service it needs. Or you got dialectical behavior therapy, right? Learning those emotional regulation skills and those mindfulness skills, which are so critical to acknowledge what am I experiencing, where am I at in my body, in my mind, and how do I ground myself back in this present moment and
Yeah,
notice where my mind is taking me, right? Like those are all so helpful.
I think controlling of your thoughts is important. I mean, my mind races. Not gonna lie. I mean, my mind races. I mean, my mind can be consumed. I can be going 100 different directions at
Yeah.
once. It's how it's always been. But the one thing that I've learned through this whole process is when I feel that my mind is doing that, and then I start feeling anxiety as a result of it doing that,
Yeah.
I try to do a lot of self talk, and I
Yeah.
try to slow down my thoughts, and I really try to live in the moment. You know, it's kind of like that whole, as cliche as it sounds, that one day at a time approach. Okay, you get a lot of different thoughts there, but what needs to be done today? You know, what needs to be done this morning? What needs to be done this afternoon? What needs to be done this evening? Let's not get the cart in front of the horse, or let's control the controllables. Focus on what needs to be done today. So it's just getting control of those thoughts, trying to live in the moment as best as you possibly can. I will say this: um, breathing exercises have been very helpful for me, specifically if I know I'm going to be in a stressful situation. Or in the past, I've gotten panic attacks, which again typically was public speaking. And which is ironic. What the irony of this is, or what's so ironic about this, is the fact that I do a lot of that now,
Yeah.
like hospitals, and mental health forums and things like that. And it's weird and I don't want to jinx anything by saying this, but every I've never had a panic attack, speaking to a group of people about mental health or addiction or recovery or coping skills or what have you. And I spoke to some pretty large groups. One instance probably larger than any group I've ever spoken to in my life. But I'm cognizant of things. I mean,
Yeah.
I try to get myself in the right frame of mind when I'm going there. I mean, I do my breathing exercises on the way there. I try to listen to the right type of music to kind of get my
Mhm.
mind straight. I mean, I do the things that I need to do to not be susceptible to a potential panic attack. And then I think the other thing is too is like I really feel comfortable in my own skin now, man. I mean, when I did public speaking, I mean, I would always be worried about somebody criticizing the way my tie was tied, or I'm not wearing an expensive enough, as an expensive suit as some of the people in the audience, or I'm not wearing, a $500 pair of shoes. I wear floor shimes for $100 or $120, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
That's how my brain went, before. Now it's like, I really don't give a crap. I am who I am. It is what it is. They're not here for me to put on a fashion show. They're here for the content I'm going to be providing, and I feel that I can bring some pretty good content.
Mhm.
I'm a pretty casual guy now. I mean, I feel really, really comfortable, and I think talking openly about this stuff, whether it's the addiction side of things or the mental health side of things and the challenges, and being so open and so honest and so transparent, um, it's it really has made me. I mean, there really is no subject that's off limits with me right now. I mean, I pretty much can talk about any subject matter. I've been asked a lot of questions with various subject matters during these referendums or these presentations or what have you. And I think that that just makes you stronger, makes you feel more comfortable, and helps with the way the brain works as well. But it's been a process. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It's been
Yeah.
a process, but there's been a lot of growth there. But the growth really came from doing things that I was taught, whether it be
Mhm.
when I was hospitalized in psychiatric care, working with the therapist, working with the psychiatrist, and embracing the concepts that they brought, and be willing to try different things. Because I only named a couple things. And I
Yeah.
named 40 things because you do private practice with therapy. They give you a list of 40 different friggin' coping skills.
Mhm.
They're not all going to work. I mean, you talk to the average person, they're going to have maybe three, four, or five that's their go-to. Which means 90% of them don't work for them, but you got to be willing to find the 10% that do work for you, and you got to be willing to try.
Definitely. No, and I think that's the part where you're kind of like, you've highlighted it before, and you were kind of highlighting it there as you're talking about, like cognitive behavior therapy, looking at the thoughts, kind of evaluating, assessing, and saying, hey, is there another way to kind of explain this, right? There's some cognitive restructuring, sometimes acknowledging that the goggles we're wearing in that moment are kind of putting a tint on the way we're experiencing life in those times. And so, Marc, I think it's been an incredible discussion, kind of going through anxiety and kind of leaning into the very thing that most people and what anxiety does at its core tell us to look away from it. And so I appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge that you had to share tonight as we kind of dove into this topic today. So, as always, our conversations air on the 1st and the 15th. So feel free to reach out to us. And we are always open to feedback and comments. And as always, Marc, it was a pleasure working with you. I look forward to seeing you on our next podcast, man.
Good. Everybody have a good day.
Thanks for joining us today on Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery. If you're on the journey to find guidance and insights, subscribe now wherever you find your podcasts. Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery is an educational resource, not a substitute for medical or therapeutic advice. The opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are not necessarily those of NAMI DuPage. Go to namidupage.org/podcast for links to past episodes, show notes, and to submit a question or topic ideas for a future episode. Until next time, be well.